start again at the top. One of the great questions is exactly what is the invisible hand? And the point I made earlier was that we tend to talk about it as though he had a concept of the invisible hand, when in fact it is an invisible hand. It is unclear as to what he meant. It is clearly some kind of corrective that happens almost instinctively, such that what we in the modern world would call surplus value passes from rich to poor. Essentially, if I have a full stomach, I'm going to let you have what I don't want to eat. He also seemed to think that in this corrective process, I somehow knew intuitively or instinctively that I have some kind of moral responsibility to you. Which allowed me to let go of the surplus value. But other than being some kind of a corrective force, we don't know, in all honesty, exactly what that meant. It's almost a kind of conscience that we are not really aware of. I reach a point where I realize I have a moral responsibility to you, but very unclear. We do from this get the concept of a self-correcting market. This eventually becomes part of free market capitalism. We don't need government intervention. We don't need laws. It's going to take care of itself. Very simple. Okay, any questions? Is this making sense?
Yes.
Okay. If you think about the implications of this, then number one, there is a fairly rigid separation between rich and poor. Two, there's an assumption that surplus value, as we would call it in the modern world, will, through some natural process, trickle down to the poor. So the richer we make the rich, the more surplus value the poor will experience. And the point I made was that in the 1980s, in the United States in particular, this was the hallmark of Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich, and it was given the name trickle-down economics. It is the hallmark of what is referred to as neoliberalism, which is a bit of a misnomer because we tend to assign liberal with someone who is focused on social justice, and that is not the case here. The idea behind trickle-down economics is If we make the rich richer, everyone will be better off. However, the reality is that if we go from 1980 to 2022, in fact, fewer Americans control more of the wealth of the country. By the way, Reagan was a Republican. All right, any questions about that so far? Okay. We can't point to a specific date in history and say this is the date when capitalism began. And while there are many different theories, I would argue that a lot of it has to do with nothing more than historical circumstance. A number of scholars point out that the rise of a mercantile class, merchants who make nothing directly, is a key ingredient in the creation of value. During the same period that this is happening, there's also a shift to a focus on bullion, as in accumulating precious metals. This in turn is a function of growing trade. Not just trade, but trade between nations. Anyone want to guess why? Okay. What is an exchange rate? Anyone know? Okay. For example, before the European Union, the franc, which was the currency of France, to the pound in England, at one point, 2 British pounds sterling equaled 1 American dollar. So the first was to stabilize the conversion rate. The second was a function of what is called the balance of trade. Anyone know what that's about? Okay. Let's talk about balance of trade for a sec. Let's take France and England. Suppose France buys $1 billion in English goods, but England only buys a $500 million. There is a deficit and inequality. That inequality would be covered or could be covered by a precious metal. Or if I had been paid in pounds sterling, but I wanted francs, I could take my pound sterling to the Bank of England and ask for gold. Can you imagine what would happen if the Bank of England didn't have the gold? The economy would collapse. And this is referred to as being on the gold standard. And the ultimate currency becomes gold. All right, this is an important point. Are there any questions so far? Anything I can make clearer? Okay, you are all there, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, for a minute there, I had the illusion that I was talking only to myself, which is pretty scary. Okay, so I'm clear so far. This is good.
Yes.
Okay. So think about this. Why would I want to come off the gold standard? Okay, if I'm on the gold standard, if I owe you something, my currency needs to be backed up by gold. The debt is real. So for every dollar in debt I am as a nation, I need a dollar's worth of gold. Was that clear?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So the amount of gold a country holds determines economic growth. It limits debt. So let's say artificially that the American economy is at $500,000. With the gold standard, for it to grow to $1 million, I need $1 million in gold. If I only have 750,000, then I can only grow halfway. Make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Anybody for whom it doesn't make sense? Okay, so So everybody is worrying about the amount of debt the United States has with China. We hear about it all the time. We're not on the gold standard. So should I worry about my debt with China? What do you think? Whitney, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I would worry.
Okay. Based upon what I'm saying,
Yes.
would you
Like
worry?
basic economics, I mean, you would still be in the negative in some fashion. So that
Okay.
would, I don't know, I don't like being in the negative, so that would cause me to worry.
Okay. Well, you see, this is where, as I say, the rubber meets the road. If you're not on a gold standard, then your currency has no value. It only has value as long as we believe it does. So if you go back to the government gave everyone $1,400 during the pandemic. Remember that?
Mhm.
If we were on the gold standard, the government would have needed $1.12 billion in gold in the bank in Fort Knox. Honestly, we don't even know if the federal government has any gold left anymore. So when you put that money in your bank, your bank looked at that check and went, oh, it's from the federal government. It must be good. Yeah, baby. The emperor has no clothes. No, the debt's not real. It's not real. If we wrote a check tomorrow to China and China put the check in their national bank and their national bank said the check was good, that's paid. That's why that's why our currency is not on the gold standard anymore. Unlimited economic growth, unlimited debt. Megan, what do you think about that?
I think that it can cause a lot of problems when inflation, pay increases aren't kept up with inflation. And then, without gold standard, there's not a whole bunch of rules as to how much the economy can grow or how much money can be worth or how much a gallon of milk can be worth. And if everything doesn't grow at the same rate, it can cause problems for lower class people.
Well, you're dead on, and that's one of the reasons why the middle class and the poor since 1970 have become appreciably poorer.
Okay, so just random question. If
Yeah.
the gold standard is like a fixed value for currency across all nations, then why can't that be for like products? Like, let's say that we set like a cap or a standard on how much you can charge for a gallon of milk. Let's say that that's $2. That's the most that you can charge for that, but you can charge less than that if you feel like it. Why Is that not like a thing?
Well, that's a great question. And I want to talk about it from several perspectives. Free market capitalism, so-called laissez-faire, argues that the market is always self-correcting. This is where we get the concept of supply and demand. So theoretically, supply goes down, demand goes up, so do prices. Demand goes down, supply increases, prices go down. Has this always worked? Absolutely not. Is it working right now? Absolutely not. But, you know, back to the Republicans, this is why they want no government regulation. Because the marketplace will take care of itself. No. There's no concrete evidence that in the last 100 years this has been true. So if we go back, there was a conference held in the US at a place called Brentwood. And it was at the end of World War II. I don't remember if it was 47 or 48. But the United States and I believe 45 other countries agreed to an exchange rate that was backed up by gold. So if you think about what's happening in 1948, 45, 48, there's only one economy in the United States, I'm sorry, in the world that's working. That's the United States. The entire rest of the world has been destroyed. So in 1948, rather than fix our own economy, we established the Marshall Plan. And we begin to rebuild the rest of the world. So between roughly 48 and 1960, it's a kind of golden age in the US. People who have never owned cars before now own cars. People for the first time moved to this place called suburbia. And people began owning homes. And one working adult can support a family of 5 people. And at this point, for the third time in its history, the United States is on the gold standard. Except by 1961, they began shipping cheap products into the United States, Germany, Japan, and Korea. If you put this in context, our industrial infrastructure is 30 plus years old, 30 years behind Germany, Japan, and Korea, and soon every other country. So by 1961, there was so much pressure on the American dollar, the dollar being the currency used by the world. Everybody measures the value of their currency against the dollar. At one point, it had been the British pound, at another point, the French franc. That the American economy is beginning to shift. So a decision is made that over a 10-year period, we come off the gold standard. So a dollar used to say, under Washington's picture, payable to the bearer on demand in gold or silver. So you could literally walk into a bank branch, put the dollar down and say, give me gold. And they had to do it. So by 1971, we're off. And in this 10-year period, there is a significant economic collapse. Which is marked by a shift to a consumer-based service economy. Wages plummet. So by 1971, it's now one adult will no longer do it. Two adults now support a family of four. So since 1971, inflation has been about 400%. For the poor and the middle class in the United States, income has increased 12 to 13%. For the wealthy, I'm an adjunct. I'm a part-time professor in the state system of North Carolina. We have not had a raise in 25 years. I'm paid $3,500 to teach a class. Is $3,500 in 2022 worth what it was 25 years ago? All right, we have a chat question. Yes.
I was just answering it. It's not worth as much as it was back then.
Correct. It is not. So one more comment before we go back and look more at the history of capitalism. So over 3 years, it was actually a 20%, 26% inflation rate. The last time the minimum wage was raised. So if you think that raising it to $15 is going to fix this problem, no, it's not. Because in free market capitalism, you take what you can get. So we were each given $1,400. What do? We spend it. The market does what? Increases prices. Have we profited? Are we better off? Because our money now buys less. The answer but Free market capitalism will not allow price controls because the market is self-adjusting. Well, if the market were self-adjusting, we wouldn't have had 7% inflation. And it wouldn't have been 26% in 3 years the last time they raised the minimum wage. All right, everybody clear about this? Is this making sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Doesn't it
Yes.
make you feel warm and fuzzy?
I have a comment.
Okay.
So I think this kind of relates to what's going on in healthcare a little bit. I'm an LPN, and a lot of the nurses from the hospital are quitting and going to travel agencies.
Mhm.
And the federal government is trying to put a cap on the agencies paying these nurses to travel because they're getting a lot more money
Mhm.
for I guess if you're going to deal with stress, you might as well get the top dollar doing it. So now the federal government is trying to place a cap on pay, so all these nurses aren't quitting the hospital and, trying to get them to go back into the hospitals instead of having to pay the travel agencies to have them come in and pay them top dollar like that. So I
Yeah.
just think that's really interesting.
Mhm. Yeah. And, if we look at the consequences of the Marshall Plan, and then we'll go back to the history of capitalism. It's 1948, and with the Marshall Plan, we decide that we're going to rebuild the world. Most Americans don't know that there were labor riots in the United States at the end of the Second World War because soldiers came back to no jobs. So what did we do? Well, we're out globalizing the world, and all of those jobs that we're now providing in Germany, Korea, Japan, and everywhere else in the world are no longer in the United States. So how did we solve the problem? Well, in typical American fashion, we didn't. We created the GI Bill, and we sent them all to college. So what happened? Well, by the time you get to 1963, colleges are breaking. They have to build. And in the world of supply and demand, what happens to tuition? So what do? Well, in typical American fashion, we don't fix it. What we do is we get this really novel idea. So what happens to tuition? And now we go, what the hell happened? And we did exactly the same thing in healthcare. Tort reform. Tort means harm. Was a problem in the 1960s when the first $1 million malpractice lawsuits were awarded. The cost of healthcare spiraled up. What did we do? Did we fix it? No, we threw more money at it. In fact, Medicare for the retired people at that time was free. Now, only a very small percentage of it is free. So what happened to the cost of healthcare? Have we had tort reform? No.
Yeah, and they don't pay for anything. But I feel like once we get older, I don't even think Medicare is even going to have any money to even, I think they're gonna have to come up with some other type of program for when we retire, because I don't even think they're gonna have enough money to even have Medicare, honestly, when I get older. So, and get ready to retire.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but if let's go back to Obamacare for a second, and then we're going to go back to capitalism. So I had Obamacare because even though I own my own company, I couldn't afford health care. And the plan at the university, if I got the plan through the university, by the time I got through paying for health care, I wouldn't make anything. So I had Obamacare. And in the last year, even though I'm in superb health, except for my eyes, it was $1,100 a month. I never went to the doctor. I never needed to go to the doctor. As I said, I wear the same size pants I did in high school. I work out 7 days a week. I'm in phenomenal shape. But because of my age, $1,100 a month. Then, because the Republicans don't want anyone to have health care if you're poor, they passed a law that made the government subsidy be taxable as income. So the last year that I had health insurance, I got hit with an $8,600 penalty. Which means that instead of paying $1,100 a month, I paid about $900. Not working. All right, any questions before we go back to the history of capitalism? We may go to about 9:15 tonight since I messed up earlier with the shared screen thing. Any questions about this? Are you beginning to see how this doesn't work and does work? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. We know that back in the day when the manor in feudal society was the cornerstone of society, that these places were self-sufficient and self-contained. Everything you needed was on the manor where you lived. Between the end of the medieval world and the 17th century, there is a transition to a more urban-based world. Which means two things. A loss of self-sufficiency and by surplus value here, I mean I get to buy and sell. As I said earlier, I don't make anything, but I buy your corn and I sell it. I pay you for it and I keep the difference. Or I buy the wool that your sheep produce. I sell the wool at a higher price than I paid for it. But I don't have any sheep. This shift will become critical because this becomes the beginning of urban poor. And this becomes the beginning of the upper class as we now know it. So when we move away from a feudal society, I, as the manor owner, can now rent or sell my land and take that profit and invest it. Buy more property, buy more things I didn't make and sell them. So if we put this in terms of what happened in the United States, the American Industrial Revolution, for all intents and purposes, and for the simplicity of argument, began around 1800. In 1800, 84% of the American population was self-sufficient. They lived on farms. A very small percent was urban. By 1900, so roughly over the span of 117 years, 98% of the American population, urban and suburban, is incapable of being self-sufficient. This is important because in feudal society, the difference between the lord of the manor and the people who worked on the land was substantial. But the lord was ultimately not that much better. He relied on the people to provide food. So in a worst case scenario, there was an interdependence that kept the relationship balanced. It was a low-tech world. But what's happened in the United States over now 122 years I'm not going to tell you that the Great Depression wasn't bad. I'm not going to tell you that the Dust Bowl, which occurred during the Great Depression, wasn't bad. But comparatively speaking, what it takes for us to stay alive is far more than it was in 1900. And that's in part because an industrial economy, at least the way it works out in the West, presupposes free market capitalism. And in free market capitalism, not only is the market self-correcting, but competition is such that I really don't have any social responsibility. Milton Friedman, my only responsibility is to generate a profit. It's particularly interesting if we go back and we talk about Adam Smith. The rich have a moral responsibility to the poor. Exactly what that moral responsibility is, we don't know. No one starves to death. That was about the end of it. What's interesting is that when we get to Charles Darwin, he links morality with the emotion of sympathy. I feel bad for you. So I feel the need to protect you. As benign as that seems, when it gets in the hands of Spencer, you remember our conversation about the Darwinian triple helix? Right? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay. Now it becomes a matter of survival. So in social Darwinism, because it enhances and promotes competition, and B, only the strong survive. If the strong don't survive, we have race suicide. Remember we talked about that? So by the middle of the 19th century, social Darwinism becomes embedded in whatever capitalism might have been before that, and free market capitalism is born. So if you put it in terms of the United States, make America great again means making the rich richer. Trickle down economics meant cutting taxes on the rich. It's the same thing Donald Trump did. We cut the taxes to the rich because the government should not inhibit competition, because by definition, since they have money, they're better suited for survival than the rest of us. And therefore, we will eat the crumbs from their table, and we need to let the big dog eat. Questions, thoughts, reactions? How do you feel about all this? Is it scaring you, upsetting you? Am I being logical? Alexis, what do you think?
I'm good about everything.
Okay, does it make you feel warm and fuzzy?
Just trying to take it all in right now.
Okay. Ashari Bolden, what do you think?
I would agree. I think I remember us talking about that, so it does kind of, it's a lot to take in.
Okay. Whitney, what do you think?
A lot. I don't understand why we just can't enjoy a simple life, why everything has to be so complicated, why we have to have so much hate and so much diversity. I don't understand a lot of I know that people love power, they love competition, they love that stuff, but I just don't, I don't agree with it.
Well, first of all, your implied questions are brilliant. And secondly, in the world of social Darwinism, wealth is an indication of your ability to survive. Wealth indicates that you are best of breed. And we want the best of breed to do just that. We want them to breed. Because the stronger they are, the less of a chance of race suicide we're going to face. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Kind of rattles you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Makes me really angry, to be honest with you.
I'm just,
Okay, let's go back to the concept of a consumer-based economy. For me to make money, you have to consume. So planned obsolescence. It used to be, for example, you bought an automobile and in the third year it started falling apart. It needed repair. Nowadays, in the second year that you own your iPhone, it starts failing to charge.
Yes, it does. Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
And Apple's goal is that every 3 years, they're going to make you buy a new one and it's going to cost you more money. And if you think about everything that we own, does the human eye see 4K?
mm,
No.
Does the human eye see 8K?
No.
No, but we're being told we need to buy 4K and 8K, right? So everything in our world is designed to drive us to consume more. So believe it or not, before the middle of the 1960s, I'm not sure the exact date, let's use 1965. There were no credit cards. And the first credit card was Diners Club. It was specifically for use in restaurants, and it could only go to a very select group of people. Now, you come out of your mother's womb and they've given you a credit card. And the incentive is to consume endlessly. You're in debt forever. So if you make a minimum payment every month at 18% interest, it'll take you over 25 years to pay off your credit card. So a sign of the economic trouble that we're in you're still paying interest. You just don't know it. The price is higher. So because the amount of money that we're making is falling, the pretense of free interest is increasing. Why? Because if we don't keep consuming, the economy will collapse. Any questions before I sum this up? I'm sure that
No.
on this cold night, this is a wonderful conversation. Yes, I'm sorry, a question?
No, I was just gonna say that's why we can't shut the country back down, because we would crash again, you know, as far as the pandemic.
Yep. That's right. Yes. So we come back to one of the articles you're supposed to read for this week. We're going to continue to look at this, but let's make a few points. From the beginning, it was classist. Second, it advocates classism because it keeps the poor poor. And it assigns more value to the rich. It's interesting when we talk more about the history of capitalism, that in the United States, we have done this. And that's not true. Socialism is not communism. They are by far and away different. One of the questions we're going to keep coming back to is the question of social responsibility. Milton Friedman was very clear. The answer is no. And I'll remind you of something I've said a few weeks ago. If the research from MIT is correct, and I believe it has been substantiated since 2017, then in 2011, for the first time, the gross domestic product went up while the total number of people employed went down. That gap continues to increase. And by 2038, 80% of our population won't make enough money to survive. And we're not doing anything about that because we continue to argue that social responsibility and capitalism are mutually exclusive. Socialism is an attempt to make capitalism socially responsible. Any questions before I pause the recording and take attendance? Have you all enjoyed this?
Yes,
Mm,
I did.
Yes.
Yeah, even if it did terrify you and make you want to get some Prozac or something. Okay, I seriously hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit glib. So let me stop recording and take attendance. Any last questions?